Hello again everyone, and welcome back for our last session. In this last session we're going to look at some of the success factors associated with a good strategic planning process. The very first point I want to make here is that the leaders must lead, and that cannot always be taken for granted in internationalization. I know of many colleagues working almost against the university leadership. They are committed to internationalization, but the leadership perhaps not quite so. So there is no point in trying to be ambitious about internationalization until the leadership is on board. I would say that the single most important success factor is the extent to which internationalization is visibly driven and supported by senior leaders. And that's not just about saying they like the idea. It's really supporting it with more than words. It's about putting a plan in place and providing the right amount of resources to let it happen. As I've put across in these 4 sessions, I believe another success factor is a holistic approach, one that considers the whole institution and not just the academic activities. Of course, it's not easy in many institutions because a holistic approach is not always the natural way. Many institutions have operated historically in a more fragmented manner with different units, different faculty, schools, departments operating almost in isolation of the rest of the institution. Another point that is very important for leadership is to understand not only the need for a university-wide approach to internationalization, but as I said before, about making decisions, making choices. And once you start to internationalize an institution, that will affect every aspect of what that institution does. And by making choices, it means that some operations will grow, some will diminish or perhaps even disappear, and some potentially could stay the same. That ultimately can be threatening in any institution, that degree of change. That's why it's so important that the leadership is on board and that they agree to these changes and are prepared to make them happen. It's not only about leadership owning the process. Everybody involved must feel committed to internationalization. And one way to make that happen is to ensure that all views are considered not only in the development of the strategic plan, but through the drafting process and implementation. There are many ways that this can happen, but if views are not brought on board right from the beginning, it's very difficult for people to buy into a plan that they had no part in the development. So even with a very, very powerful leader, the plan may not be successful because if people are not committed to it, if they don't believe in it, they may not feel it's really their responsibility to take responsibility for, to have commitment for the different actions. And sometimes plans can even be carried out without people even aware that they're there. I've spoken to colleagues in different institutions who didn't even know their university had a plan for internationalization. So that's never a good thing either. Another point I want to make that is critical to the success factor, that this plan is real, that it really is about making change happen in the institution. And to do that, you have to, in your resource management section of the plan, think about the incentives you're going to put in place to encourage people to participate fully. It's about communicating the plan so that there's ownership from the very beginning, from the drafting of that plan right through to its delivery. You want a plan that's realistic, but at the same time is ambitious. There's a bit of a contradiction, but you have to think realistically, what can you achieve in that plan, and how might you stretch the university a little bit beyond where it is right now. As I've said before, it's about making choices. Once you have that plan, you're actually going to implement it. You're not just going to put it on your website or show it to visitors. You actually want to implement it. And you will have a review process in place to ensure that the plan is being carried out successfully. Alternatively, and believe me, there are many plans like this, the plan is just a wish list. It doesn't really have any sense of reality. It may be a plan that was developed just by the senior management team or sometimes even the international office. It's just a plan that somebody in the university at some level developed. At times it's there just because, well, we think it's a good idea to have one, perhaps to apply for some funding, you need to show that you have a plan, maybe your government requires you to have one. But again, it's basically just propaganda. It's just there because somebody said you had to have this plan. It's not connected to anything that's really going on in the university. There are very few instruments in place for it to be properly implemented. And even if it's not properly implemented, there are no consequences. Life goes on as ever, okay? So obviously we're saying we want a real strategic planning exercise, and that paper plans in this sense are of no use whatsoever. I don't have time to go into this in detail, but I leave it there for you to consider. I have touched on the idea of organisational culture, and we haven't had time to go into it in any detail here, but I have mentioned that typically the traditional culture of many higher education institutions does not lend itself to strategic planning. And here you can see on the left-hand side a number of characteristics that can be found in some very traditional universities, and the type of cultural change that would be necessary to become more strategic in their approach to internationalization. And so you can reflect a little bit on where your universities sit there as well. Have you left everything on the left side and have moved entirely over to the right, or are there still areas where you feel your institution will probably need to develop some change, and to what extent internationalization could be a lever for that change? And as you see at the bottom, there's an arrow here around speed of evolution. So again, could internationalization be a way of accelerating some of those changes? Internationalization is often perceived in some institutions as a lever for change, not just an enhancer of quality, but a way to bring about change in the institution as well. So if you do have a strategic plan, you might want to have a look at it and say, is there anything in that plan that's seeking to bring about this type of change in the institution as well? And so as we wrap up here, just a quick overview of some of the keys to strategic planning success in internationalization. As we've said throughout this session, a future focus in the vision and mission and goals for internationalization, and a vision and mission that is inspiring, creative, that makes people in the institution feel that it's worth carrying out. As we've said in this session, a commitment of the leadership, but also the extent to which that plan, that vision, those ideas are being communicated to everybody who works in the university, that they understand it, share it, believe in it, and are willing to participate in it. We've talked also about how important it is to have careful implementation of the plan and also careful development. So a good plan stands a much better chance of being successfully implemented. So, and part of ensuring that is done is to involve as many people as possible, as many ideas as possible brought in the consultation phase, so that decisions can be made that take in as broad a view as possible. We've talked also about the importance of resource management in the plan, that there has to be an appropriate budget. We need human capacity. Are there human resources in place to deliver this plan? Do people have the right training? What's happening in our environment round about us? How realistic is this plan? Does it respond appropriately to the context in which we're operating? And as I've highlighted several times, you don't just roll out a plan. You will need a plan, an action plan, yes, to make it happen, but of course you must be continually reviewing the plan, monitoring it, making any adjustments as necessary as the environment round about you changes, both internally and externally. New opportunities might appear, new threats might appear, and they have to be taken on board and the plan adapted accordingly, which of course implies that you need to be flexible in the course of your implementation. And one point I would like to make here that hasn't come up so far is the importance of celebrating the successes in your internationalisation plan. It's always a good idea to start with a few easy steps that can be celebrated early on in the plan and get people more enthusiastic about it and believe that it really can happen. And that's one last point I would like to make before we wrap up, of course, is that strategy does not happen in a straight line. Okay, I've been implying that in many of the things I've said, that we need to be flexible to the changes that will happen in our environment. We may write a plan for 3 to 5 years, but we're imagining our future, but we cannot know it. And things will inevitably change, and we have to be ready for that. So the university needs to be able to rethink its strategy, to transform continuously. There is a point here about being able to develop a plan, to set out very clearly in words, on paper, exactly what you want to do, but at the same time remain opportunistic. Be willing to change the plan as the situation changes round about you. So I like to think of strategic planning not as an instrument of control, which is what many people think, and that is why often they resist strategic planning in higher education, but one of facilitation, one that can help the institution develop. So I like to think of strategic planning as a way to be more creative, be more innovative, not about reducing the ability of an institution to build its own future. So in other words, people who work in strategic planning should be agile, flexible and creative, not rigid bureaucrats. Okay, and so often I say engaging in strategic thinking is more important than the plan itself. The plan is the starting point, but it's a living document, one that will change with the institution. And so my last question to you, the last question for your assignment, is to think now about your own institution's international aspirations. Some of you may have a strategic document, some of you may not. But in one way or another, perhaps through what your rector or president says, through some of the documents that are made public, declarations on the website, various speeches that are made, what do you see as the challenges in your university's international aspirations? And what degree of change do you think is required to ensure that these ideas become reality? So if you do have a plan and look at it, is it a realistic plan? Is it a well-written plan? Does it have all the follow-up that we talked about earlier on in place? Or if there is no plan in place, simply when internationalisation is mentioned, what is said, what are the expectations round about it? And if you were in charge of the institution and were going to make change, what would you say would support internationalisation more? What barriers would you remove, or what enablers would you put in place to ensure internationalisation is realised in your institution?